All right, at the end of the last video, I just started what's called puppet warp on a duplicate of my hero layer. So let me take my history back before I did that so I can remind you how to do it. Okay, so I had just rasterized the duplicate I made of what I call the hero asset. So in an ideal world, when you're working with multiple assets, especially ones you've created, you want to keep them as a smart object in your layers. And then you duplicate that smart object by hitting Command J, and then you right-click on that duplicate to rasterize the duplicate. So I've made the duplicate orange and the hero asset that I'm leaving alone as blue. Now in order to see the changes I make, I'm going to turn off the blue layer, the hero layer, and now I'm only affecting the rasterized duplicate. Now something I can do to affect these pixels directly is to warp it, but not warp it overall, warp it according to the anatomy of my creature. In order to do that, I turn it into what's called a puppet. And Pablo, no eating at the desk, but you can eat up at the social lounge. So I go to Edit, just like I can go to Free Transform for regular warping and rotating and all that. But I go to Edit, and I'm going to click on Puppet Warp, which is just 2 above Free Transform. Puppet Warp puts this polygonal grid on top of my cutout layer. So it only works well if you already have your creature nicely trimmed out. So there's not a lot of debris floating around. And if you have any debris floating around, it will show it to you pretty clearly. Okay, next, I want you to think of this like it's a dead insect, right? And how are you going to make that dead insect look posed to put into a shadow box frame for your uncle's retirement gift? I don't know what you use dead insects for. You have to pin it down, right? You have to pose it and pin it. So when you hover your cursor, when you're in Puppet Warp, you'll see that your cursor looks like a push pin. And think of it like pinning an insect. I'm going to pin it where I want to be able to control its pose. So I don't pin it anywhere. I pin it where the ends of its skeleton are. Its feet. And it will leave these little blue dot pins. Its tail. Its shoulder. Maybe its hand. And definitely its nose, kind of the leading part of its head, right? So what does this mean? So think, if this is an insect and I've put a pin in all those places, if I want to move one of them, I have to move the pin, right? But all the other pins will stay put. So if I want to move the head, I would move this pin. And I can change the pose of the head a little bit. Maybe cock its head back a bit so that I'm getting a little bit more overlap. I can add pins whenever I want. Like if I want this to flare up at the back of the head, I can do that. And it will affect everything that's not pinned. If I want to move the arm, I can do that, and the body will stay pretty rigid, but the anatomy will kind of shift to support the change of that arm. If I want to move the foot, I can lift it up and put it down. Lift it up, put it down, right? Within limited range. If I want to move the tail, same thing. If I want to move this foot, I can. Now, every time you do this, it's going to soften the pixels slightly at their edges. Because when you stretch it, it has to make up pixels. But it is within very tolerable rounds. Now, why do we do it on a duplicate? Because now I can turn on what was there behind it, and I can toggle, and I can see, okay, that's what it was. This is what it is. Is that better or worse? I don't think it's particularly helpful. So I'm going to try it again. So I'm going to go back in my history before I puppet warped. And then I'm going to do it again. Edit, puppet warp. And this time maybe I don't pin it in quite so many places. Because the more places you pin it, the less it will move naturally in every other place. And this time I'm just going to pin the feet. And then I'm just going to move this 1 foot to give it a slightly wider stance. And when I did that, everything else moved with it. The only thing that stayed put was the 1 foot. And so that foot now is lifting up a little bit. Seems like it has a little bit more life to it. I hit return. I compare it. It was like that. Now it's like this. That looks a little bit more grounded in the space. Do I want to mess with it anymore? I can puppet warp it again, edit puppet warp. And this is a good way to learn it. Kind of very limited pins. And the only pin I'm going to add is to the head, and then I'm just going to play with that alone. And I'm just going to crunch it down a little. Like he's squatting versus the more upright. And I think that's helpful. You know, from this to this. Now, there are some things I don't like about that. I like the idea of him squatting, but I don't like how now the peak of his beak is lined up with this rope. That's called the tangency. It's a little distracting. So I'm going to go back before that, and I'm going to puppet warp it again with that in mind. And I also don't want the hand to line up with the edge of the boat. That's a tangency. That's an uncomfortable touching of elements. That hurts the depth of it. So I go to edit puppet warp, and now informed by that, I pin it in the same places, keep the feet where they are, but I'm going to move the head. I'm just going to move it a little bit beyond that rope, right? I'm going to keep the hand where it is, and maybe just widen the head a little bit by pinning it at the back of the skull and then just pulling that out just a tiny bit. So instead of squatting, it's more just kind of shifting a little more upright. Yeah. And then, of course, at any time, I can just pick it up and move it with the move tool. Like maybe just shift it a little bit to the left. Okay, I'm liking that pose on it. So now I have angled the anatomy to match the scene. That's good. I'm going to save it, Command S. So that's 1/2 of one part of a 3-part rubric. The next is matching the lighting. So I'm going to duplicate it again just to make it really clear what changes I'm making. You can choose whether you want that many duplicates or not. And now on this duplicate, I am going to play with the direct adjustments. So the first way to play with the lighting is just the overall, the levels. Do I want my creature brighter or do I want it darker? I think I want it just a tiny bit brighter in the midtones. Right? But I want to limit its highlights a little bit. And I can then go to the thing it's standing on, and I can also adjust those levels. So I'm in control of all of these aspects of lighting. So just limit the highlights a little bit. Okay, next. Color balance. This can make big differences if needed. It's about the temperature of the lighting. And I feel like mine's pretty close already. I'm just looking at the whites. But this will show you. Do I want the midtones to be a little bit warmer? Do I want them to be a little bit cooler? It looks like just slightly cooler. Do I want them to go a little bit more towards cyan or more towards red? It looks like just slightly red. So very subtle shifts. It does make a difference. Slightly towards magenta or slightly towards green. Neither. I want to keep it right at 0. Because neither of those seems effective. Now I go to shadows. Shadows, do I want them to go more towards yellow or more towards blue? Looks like just a tiny bit towards blue. More towards cyan, more towards red. Honestly, a little bit towards cyan. More towards magenta, more towards green. It looks like just a tiny bit towards green. So you can get surprised by this. You just let your eyes dictate what you think matches. And you get better at this with practice. And then the highlights. I'll usually do the highlights just slightly opposite of what I did with the shadows. And that gives more dimension. So since I went green with the shadows, I go to magenta. Since I went blue with the shadows, I go towards yellow. Since I did red or cyan with the shadows, I go a little bit towards red. And you can always see that was a lot of decision making for a very subtle shift, but now you see how those oranges and those yellows kind of pick up the same temperature tones that we have in that sky and in that lighting. And of course I could do it to every element around. Okay, that is the overall lighting. The next thing is really important. It's the direction of the lighting. So first of all, where is the light coming from? Now, we don't need to be experts in light logic. You just need to observe your scene, right? So if I'm looking at my scene, there's obviously light hitting the boat here. There's obviously light hitting the boat here. So the only light there isn't from the sky. There is kind of like a bustling dock full of lights that have just turned on that are showing what's called key light full front onto this scene. And then luckily my creature also has pretty strong lighting on the front, right? Then my creature also has pretty heavy lighting from above. So does the boat, this rim of the boat. Doesn't look like that so much in the background, right? There's little hints of it. So how can I play with the direction of lighting? What I'm going to do is create a non-destructive overlay layer where I can dodge and burn anything in the image without hurting the pixels underneath. So this is the first indirect adjustment we're making. And we're not doing it with a clipping mask. We're not doing it with an adjustment layer. We're doing it with what's called a non-destructive overlay layer. So I create a brand new layer on top of everything. Brand new empty layer. I'm going to mark it gray by right-clicking near the eyeball, marking it gray. I'm going to label it non-destructive overlay, right? Or you can just do overlay for short. Then I'm going to fill it with middle gray. Edit fill. This is a new skill with 50% gray. Okay, 100%. That does not look that good. Why is it called a non-destructive overlay layer? Well, because if I turn it from normal mode to overlay mode, it's absolutely invisible. But I'll just show this on normal mode so you can see what it's doing. If I dodge and burn it, so if I want to intensify the lighting, I would dodge it to brighten it. I would use a soft 0% hardness brush, pretty large, on the midtones, an exposure of less than 30. Let's say I really want to brighten it. Well, I can brighten middle gray a lot. Right? And now, when I say overlay mode, you can see how that affects the image without actually hurting the pixels underneath. And if I say, no, that's too much, I didn't want that, I can also take the opacity down and decide, okay, how much of that side lighting do I want? Does that make sense? Okay, I'll put it back to 100%. I'll put it back to normal mode so you can see. And then if I want to burn, like a shadow underneath my creature, which would make sense if there's light hitting it from above, I'm going to burn the midtones, exposure of less than 30. Pretty big, but maybe not quite as big as I used otherwise. And I can make a shadow. Now I'm just guessing here. I'm not actually sure where my creature is, but I can make a shadow. And that shadow is going to be darkest at the base of the creature, and then it's going to soften out as it pulls away. And because I don't have a strong direction for that overhead light, it's going to kind of pull in both directions. Now if I set that to overlay mode, you can see that shadow. I just kind of missed where it was a tiny bit, right? But you know what I can do? I can actually grab it and I can simply move it. Put that shadow where I think it needs to be. Okay, now if I show you that non-destructive overlay layer at normal mode, it looks like this. That looks pretty crazy.